Please be seated.
All right, the question's been withdrawn, and you may go ahead with your next question, Mr. Colby.
Judge, when I publish Exhibit 19.
Yes.
Mr. Klug, let me show you your notes. Let's see. Bring it forward first. Cutting off just a very little bit of the bottom and the top. But those are your notes, Mr. Klug, correct?
Yes, they are.
And you can go behind you, just point here. I don't have one of those nice laser printer. And you'll see that most of your notes are here on the left-hand margin, correct?
That's correct.
And most notably is this phrase in here that's tucked in the middle of the text, correct?
Yes.
When you say this,
And the phrase is, he talked about killing his wife. That's tucked in the middle of the line, correct?
That's correct.
It's sort of squeezed in between two other lines, correct?
Yes.
And the part that says he talked about killing his wife, that's not in cursive, whereas the rest of the notes are in cursive, correct?
That's correct.
And I'm not sure how significant it is, but it's also the,
well,
it appears.
let me just,
Yeah, but he said this is not in cursive, this is in cursive, that's not in cursive.
I know the witness is the one who's answering, but that actually is not true entirely, because the Don Cooper is also printed.
Actually, Your Honor, there's a lot of stuff that's printed here besides that.
Right.
Guy Talk at Bar is printed. There's,
Most of that is cursive, correct?
Yes.
And at the very top, premeditated also is tucked in a little bit of indentation, correct?
That's correct.
And at the bottom, he wanted to get rid of her. That's a little bit indented as well, correct? The very bottom.
Correct.
Now, Mr. Klug, he talked about killing his wife. That had to be squeezed in there because you added that to your notes later on, right?
No.
And that he wanted to get rid of her. Are you able to tell me, is that the same handwriting as the rest of it? Is that your hand?
It's handwritten, yeah.
I mean, that's your handwriting as well as all the rest of it?
Yes.
Okay. And you're saying you did not write that later on, correct?
No.
All right. Because if you took out those indented portions of things, there's nothing in your notes that says anything about killing, correct?
That's correct.
And that's true for both S18 and S19, right?
I don't have them in front of me to compare.
Let me just give you a copy so we can keep that on there. Let me give you a copy for a moment.
There's a spot that says get rid.
And that's right above, you talked about killing her, that's kind of squeezed in at the end of that line, correct?
Correct.
So, correct, there's nothing about Mark talking about killing her other than what's squeezed in the middle, right?
That's written in my notes, you're saying?
Yes.
Yes.
And these notes, again, were prepared for your conversation with the district attorney's office, right?
They after, yes, that would have been the date, March 21st of '02.
But that's the purpose of these notes, is to help you with your conversation, correct?
No, the notes were made at the time of the conversation, or just slightly after.
And my understanding of your testimony earlier today was that these notes were prepared to assist you in remembering things when you talk to the DA.
What I put, the time is after, so they would have been written both before and after.
This morning you said it was written all at one time.
No, because how could the time be on there before?
So that's the only thing you added afterwards.
That's correct.
Okay.
So this was, yes, you're right.
Other than the time, this was prepared to help you in the conversation that you plan to have with the DA, right?
That's correct.
And the conversation with the DA, you said nothing about killing his wife, right?
No, that's correct.
And that would be consistent with your notes if you excluded the things that are squeezed in later, correct?
Repeat the question.
Sure. Your failure to mention anything about him killing his wife would be consistent with the notes if you took out, excluded anything that's indented, right?
No. Because as I did not talk, I talked about, if you read back my testimony, it was I talked about the computer.
So that would be one additional thing you may have talked about, right?
Correct.
And you're denying that you added, he talked about killing his wife later.
Yes, I am.
Now, this conversation was, that you've talked about, that you had with Mark in the coffee bar of the Marriott, right?
In the hotel lobby, yes, correct.
The two of you, right?
Correct.
Okay. And what that says behind you, that portion that's a little bit highlighted towards the bottom, is Mark Jensen unloaded on us, gave his story about wife, affair. Us, Mr. Klug. Who is us?
That would have been Dawn.
You indicated that Dawn was not there.
I did say that he unloaded, no, I did say that Dawn was there at the time he was talking about marital problems, because Dawn was also talking about marital problems.
So she was there after you came back down at 2:45.
No, because that says 2:30. She was not there past that time, that I recollect.
I'm sorry. What says 2:30? What says 2:30?
2:30 would have been the bar closing, and then I went back to my room. Yes, she would have been there at that was the bar closing.
And
Then I went upstairs. So yes, she would have been there.
Well, this morning, earlier, you indicated that there was no conversation about wives, spouses, prior to the time you went up at 2:30.
No. Not about killing spouses.
And the story is about affairs, correct?
That's correct.
Objection, what story is about affairs?
The story that Mark Jensen gave you was about his wife's affairs, right? Right?
Mark Jensen unloaded on this. Yeah, his wife's affairs at that point, yes.
And the story, the story that he gave you, he told you that his wife had been depressed, correct?
Yes.
He explained that that was causing problems in his marriage, right?
Yes.
And that's what he talked about in that coffee bar, right?
Yes.
And Don Cooper was there after 2:30 listening to that, right?
Objection, this has been asked and answered.
Yes.
Let me show you. The backside of Exhibit 19, second page. Let's see if I got the whole thing. And we see on this second page that Benadryl is sort of squeezed in there, right?
I object to the term squeezed, Your Honor.
He can answer, the witness can answer as to whether that's his opinion.
It's in my notes.
And the Benadryl portion, though, is sort of squeezed in the middle rather than on the left-hand side, correct?
It's actually in the middle of the page, yes.
And the bottom says, Dawn, best friends with Kelly. I called her Rockford Baird. Called Guy Talk, remembered conversation.
Correct.
The conversation she remembered was the only one that was had, which was some discussion about problems with spouses, right?
At that time, yes.
And that's the only conversation you had with Mr. Jensen that night.
No, with Dawn you're talking about.
I'm talking about with you. That was the only conversation was about spousal problems and depression and your affairs, Mark's wife's affairs, and Kelly and Dawn's divorce. That's the conversation that happened.
No.
So Dawn was there when you came down at 2:40, 2:45, right?
Yes.
And she stayed how much longer?
I don't recall.
And I guess I'll turn that right back on. Show you Exhibit D24, your phone conversations. And Dawn, a little background on Dawn, by the way. Dawn was somebody that you had met in Appleton. She was part of the transition team, is that right?
That's correct.
And she was also at this convention, right?
Yes,
And she lived in St. Louis, is that right?
that's correct. I'm not sure if it's St. Louis or in Southern Illinois.
In the St. Louis area, though?
Correct.
Right, okay. Thank you for that clarification. And I think I'd asked you yesterday if you engaged in any flirting with her, and you indicated no. Is that the case?
There would have been conversation. I don't know what you described as flirting.
Well, let me just ask, were you flirting with her?
No.
Okay. Were you asked the following questions and you gave the following answer the last time you testified, page 26, beginning at line 13 is the 13 and 14 is the question. The answer is at line 6. Question, page 26, line 13. And were you engaged in some flirting activity with Dawn? Answer, yes, I'm sure there was. Between you and Miss Cooper? Answer, yes. So that was the case?
Yes.
Mr. Klug, now we'll look at Defense Exhibit 24. We can see at 2:34 is that 2-minute phone call you had, right?
You mean the 2-minute call that my wife called me?
Yes.
Yes, that's correct.
And that's the one in which there was no conversation with, about Mark Jensen, right?
There would have been a conversation that who I may have been with, but not,
Not about any conversation you had had.
that's correct.
And then at 3:38, there's another telephone call that lasts 4 minutes, right?
That's correct.
And that's what establishes that you were in your room for the rest of the night, correct? Right, you recall going back to your room to get that phone call?
No, I had gone back to my room at that time.
Right, for the rest of the night, correct?
That's correct.
And so you were back certainly by 3:38, and you can't say how much before that you were back in your room.
That's correct.
And in this conversation, when your wife called, you had an argument, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's already asked this witness about that conversation. How many times are we going back to the same conversation again?
I don't think we concluded that.
The objection's overruled.
Let me ask it this way. Your wife started out by asking you in that conversation, why are you out so late?
Correct.
And then you proceeded to have an argument during that conversation, right?
Again, Your Honor, I apologize. Which conversation are we talking about?
Yesterday, there was a discussion about there was a characterization as a fight, there was a characterization as a disagreement, and now we have argument. So it's actually not the same question, but also I do agree with the observation that we have to be very clear about what conversation we're talking about.
The only one I've raised is 3:38 right now.
Okay, go ahead.
Repeat the question.
And then you proceeded to have an argument during that conversation at 3:38, right?
That's correct.
And this is the conversation when your wife expresses her concern that you've been in a bar where there's women, right?
That's correct.
And she expresses her concern about you having an affair, right?
Correct.
And you denied that there were any women involved, correct?
That's correct.
And you told your wife there were females in the group, but you didn't have anybody in your room, right?
That's correct.
And you denied any interest in any of the females, correct?
That's correct.
So you spent your time in this conversation arguing with your wife about her suspicions about you, true?
That was part of it.
And the conversation was 4 minutes long, correct?
That's correct.
And then you hung up on your wife?
The conversation was over.
Did somebody hang up in anger during that conversation?
I may have hung up, yeah.
In anger?
I don't recall.
And then the next conversation, your wife calls back at 4:01, correct?
Correct.
And that's a 1-minute conversation, right?
Correct.
And that's a 1-minute conversation because you're continuing to fight about her suspicions and you hang up on her, right?
No, we were talking about Mark Jensen.
In a 1-minute conversation?
Yes, part of the conversation.
And you had told her that you were complaining about spouses, right?
I told her what we were talking about in the lobby, yes.
Did you tell her that you were complaining about spouses?
Yes.
She wasn't happy about that?
I don't recall.
Objection calls for speculation on the part of this witness.
She expressed
Objection sustained.
she expressed unhappiness about.
And where are we headed here, Mr. Albee?
Well, I mean, they're not. There's other things that are occupying the Klugs in these conversations.
True.
Other
But, all right, go ahead.
And you're continuing to disagree in each of these conversations with your wife, right?
Correct.
And you had gossiped to your wife about Mark having an affair with Kelly?
You had
Gossiped with your wife
gossiped with your wife?
about Mark having an affair with
You
Kelly?
mean in this call or on a previous?
No, prior to this evening.
I don't recall.
But that would explain one reason why your wife would be upset with you being out with Mark, perhaps.
Objection
right?
calls for speculation on the part of this witness as to what would cause this witness's wife to be upset.
Sustained.
Now, you spoke with your wife after this occasion, you say numerous times about the conversation you had with Mark Jensen?
Yes.
Dozens?
No, not that many times.
And you spoke with her throughout, from 1998 to 2007, because you were struggling with this, right?
I don't believe there was a lot of conversation about it.
Do you agree you spoke with her numerous times?
A few times.
I'm asking, would you agree that you spoke with your wife numerous times?
Yes.
And your wife wants to support you, right?
Objection calls for speculation on the part of this witness as to what his wife wants to do.
You expressed yesterday that your wife would support whatever your decision was, right?
She would support whatever decision I would, if I were to come forward or not come forward.
And she doesn't want you to look foolish on the witness stand. She's expressed that, right?
I don't know if my wife would want to make me look foolish or not.
And I asked about antifreeze, but I guess I neglected to ask. The first time you ever mentioned ethylene glycol to anybody was yesterday in this courtroom too, right?
No, it was not.
Did you tell the prosecutors on July 27th?
Yes, because ethylene glycol was part of Benadryl.
Did you testify to that on July 30th?
I don't recollect. Maybe you could read back my transcript or whatever the terminology is that I can hear my testimony.
Well, we'll go back to page 80, line 18. And did he mention any other medications or drugs or anything? Answer, no. The only thing I recall is Benadryl because, you know, that's the only thing I remember. You said nothing about ethylene glycol, right?
No, there's testimony about the airport conversation to my wife. If you read that part of my transcript, it talks about, she asked why Benadryl. If you'd read that part back.
Your wife's testimony that you didn't?
No, I'm talking about when I called her at the airport. That's a 7-minute conversation, the airport conversation.
I'm sorry, was there a question?
We were continuing the conversation on, you asked about...
Mr. Klug.
Yeah, would you ask a question, Mr.?
Mr. Klug, I'd be happy to give you your entire exhibit. It's D25. You've reviewed this recently. You can find,
What was
if you can find ethylene glycol in there, I'd love to see it.
Council, what was the date of that one?
That's July 30th.
Well, why don't, you can, rather than have the witness examine the transcript with some 108 pages, we'll, you can continue your examination on another point, or you can pursue this one, I don't care. And if necessary, he can be recalled to the witness stand later and after having examined it.
Well, Judge, why don't I do this? Why don't I conclude for the moment, assuming there's any redirect, and I can take that up on recross right away, because that's the last subject I have.
That's fine.
One more. I got to ask one more. Well, no, that's it. I'm done.
Mr. Jennings?
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you have the exhibit there in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Okay, could you turn to page...
Exhibit D25.
Yeah, turn to page 80 of D25, please.
I'm sorry, what page?
Page 80.
80?
80. Do you have that, Your Honor? Do you need a copy? Your Honor, do you need a copy of that exhibit?
I have it.
Okay. Directing your attention to line 13. Do you recall being asked the following question and giving the following answer? Question. What did Mr. Jensen say about Benadryl? Answer. He said it was something that it would slowly crystallize you from the outside or the inside of your body out, and was pretty much undetectable. And then do you recall being asked the following question that Mr. Albee had posed to you? Question, here anyway, question, and did he mention any other medications or drugs or anything? Answer, no, the only thing I recall is Benadryl, because that's the only thing I remember. So now putting that in context, does that fairly represent your recollection at the time that you were testifying about this case?
Any statement about putting it in context or not?
That's correct.
Now, and earlier when you were testifying, you said antifreeze, Benadryl. Could you state whether or not, are you of the impression that antifreeze is somehow connected to Benadryl or the other way around?
Objection to the leading.
Overruled.
Yes, what I've been testifying is the fact that in Benadryl...
Just let me...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't care about what you've been testifying about.
Okay.
Okay, and if I've given you that impression, I apologize. Okay. And I want to make something clear. When you're testifying, we're really interested in knowing what you specifically recollect from way back then, what your understanding was then, and what your understanding is now. So was it then or is it now your understanding that there is some connection between antifreeze and Benadryl?
Yes.
Tell us your understanding of that.
Yes, my understanding is that Benadryl has components inside of the makeup of the drug that its base is antifreeze or ethylene glycol, which is the main component of Benadryl. So they're afraid of, yeah.
Now this understanding that you have, is that based upon something that you knew before your conversation with Mr. Jensen, or something that came after the conversation with Mr. Jensen, or it was your impression based upon your conversation with Mr. Jensen?
It was my understanding that I learned that from Mark Jensen through conversation.
And this was that night of November, the early morning hours of November 7th?
That's correct.
After you'd had several glasses of wine and beer and Crown Royal?
That's correct.
Now, I also want to make something else clear to you. If you don't remember something from 9 years ago, you understand you can say, I don't remember.
Okay, yes.
You understand that?
Yes.
In fact, if you don't remember, you're supposed to say you don't remember. You're not supposed to try to supply an answer to a question you don't know the answer to.
Okay.
And similarly, if you're asked a question about the...
I think there's enough education. I think he knows how to answer the questions.
Well, I have to say, I don't think that there's any harm in what's being stated. Go ahead.
So if you're asked a question about a previous transcript or a question even about your notes that were allegedly made sometime in March of 2002, if you don't know without reading it, then you can ask to read it first before you answer. You understand that?
Yes.
So if I ask you a question and you don't know the answer to it, tell me you don't know. Now, let's go back to these notes. I don't have the notes in front of me. Do you have them in front of you or not?
No, I don't.
Oh, they're over here. Exhibit S18 and S19. Now, as you're sitting here today, without looking at these notes, do you remember what specific date you wrote these notes?
I wrote those notes on the date that I called the office. It was back in '02.
The district attorney's office.
Correct, the district attorney's office.
Now, on cross, you made reference to a conversation. Was there a conversation between you and some member of the district attorney's office in March of 2002?
Yes, there was.
Okay. Now, tell me about the conversation if you remember the conversation. If you don't remember, tell me you don't remember it. If you remember, tell me what you remember.
Yep. The conversation that I had when I called down is, as I said, Mark was my boss for a period of time, that he was using our computers, and that I thought maybe they should come up and look at the computers. And beyond that, I did not volunteer any other information.
Now, what you have just described is not so much a conversation as a statement.
Correct.
Was there any response when you talked to the person at the DA's office?
Not that I can recall.
Do you know, in fact, as you sit here today, did you actually talk to a person at the DA's office, or did you leave a voicemail message?
I don't believe I talked to a person.
So what does that mean?
That it may have been a voicemail, and I may have put the time.
Objection to speculation.
Well, I don't think he's speculating. I think he's stating what he states is the best of his memory.
And that brings up the issue again. Don't speculate. If you don't know the answer, tell me you don't know the answer.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, what?
Please repeat that.
Okay. As you're sitting here now today, do you remember, did you actually speak to a person at the DA's office, or did you just leave a voicemail message?
I believe it was a voicemail.
And directing your attention to Exhibit S18, I guess I'll put it over here so that everybody can see it. Is that a part of your the notes that you made on or around March 21st, 2002?
Yes, they are.
And what does it say there after March 21st, 2002?
It says 4:10 in the afternoon in 2 seconds, so I would have looked at my computer and put the time on there.
And what does it say that you did?
Yes, I called the D and left a voice message.
So you didn't actually talk to a human being, you left a voicemail message.
Correct.
Now, all of the notes that you made on exhibits S18 and S19, as you're sitting here today, right now in court, do you have a recollection as to whether all those notes were made on one day or if they were made over different days? These notes, S18 and S19.
I believe that they were written during that time,
During what time?
the time after that I left the voicemail.
So, well, time could be a day, time could be a week.
Yeah.
Was it within one day or was it over a period of days? Or don't you remember?
I don't remember.
No, that wasn't so hard to say I don't remember, was it? And now let's go back to November 7th,
Correct.
1998. You've had many, many drinks, and you're sitting in the coffee bar or coffee shop or lobby of the hotel with Mark Jensen. Yes?
Yes.
As you're sitting here now today, I want you to tell me every single thing that you remember now as you're sitting here today. And we'll go through it piece by piece. Number one, in your mind's eye, if you can do this, look around in the hotel lobby. Besides you, who else is there?
What point are you talking?
At the point around the time of the conversation where Mark Jensen was talking to you about killing his wife.
There was just myself and Mark at that point.
Now, at that point, you'd had a total of how many drinks over the preceding several hours?
Between 8 and 10.
But you do not believe that you were under the influence of an intoxicant.
That's correct.
What about Mr. Jensen? What was your perception of Mr. Jensen?
My impression of Mr. Jensen was that that he had been drinking.
Now, as you're sitting here today, without regard to any prior testimony or anything else, as you're sitting here today, do you recall whether or not Mr. Jensen made any reference to any specific websites?
He made mention of websites that you could go to on how to kill your wife, and talked about websites for poisons.
Okay. Did he give you the name of any of those websites?
He gave me names, but I don't remember the names.
If you heard one of the names, might that refresh your recollection?
It might.
Did he ever mention a website entitled www.killyourwife.com?
You know, that's because I do remember Kill Your Wife, and yes. Yes.
So as you're sitting here now today, you believe that he used that?
Yes.
Now, tell us what else he told you, aside when he was talking about these websites, what did he tell you? As you remember it here today, as
Correct.
much as you can of that conversation.
He told me that there was poisons that you could use that would be undetectable to a normal medical examination.
And did he tell you what those drugs were?
The only drug I can remember was Benadryl.
Now, what else did he tell you about that, as you're sitting here today, that you can remember?
Yes. Mark Jensen told me that Benadryl, the effects of the chemical in your body would slowly crystallize you from the inside out.
And was there anything else that he told you about? Aside from the fact There are two things he's apparently told you. Number one, well, three things. Number one, it'll kill you. Number two, it'll kill you by crystallizing you from the inside out.
That's correct.
And number three, it was somehow, in your estimation, associated with Benadryl. Was there anything else?
Yes, that the ethylene glycol was a major component of Benadryl.
That was your impression.
That's correct.
After several drinks and Mr. Jensen telling you something.
Correct, he opened up to me.
Now, as you're sitting here today, is there anything else that you can remember about that conversation?
Well, he told me that his wife was very depressed, sickly. That's all I think I can remember, unless there's something else in my...
That's fine. That's fine. If that's all you remember, that's all I wanted to know. Now, as you're sitting here today, can you tell me what you can remember about who it was, the first person that you mentioned the words ethylene glycol or antifreeze to when you were talking about this conversation with somebody else?
That was my wife, Joanne Klug.
Okay. Tell me everything you can remember about when and where the conversation occurred between you and your wife where you mentioned the words ethylene glycol or antifreeze in connection with this conversation that you'd had with Mark Jensen.
That the ethylene glycol would have been at the airport.
Tell us about the conversation that occurred between you and your wife at the airport.
I was calling her to let her know what time my plane would be in, and that she kept, when I called, there was a collect call, which is listed up there. We talked about, she kept questioning me as to, because I kept saying Benadryl, and she wanted to know how Benadryl could kill a person, because she was really upset the fact that I had told her that the night before. And I told her that Benadryl had the same properties of antifreeze, which would be ethylene glycol.
That was your impression.
That was my impression of it.
The makers of Benadryl would probably disagree with that assessment, by the way.
Yeah, I hope they're not listening.
I'm sure they are. You've never looked at the side of a Benadryl box to see what's contained in it.
No, I haven't.
If it had ethylene glycol, they'd probably take it off the market. You understand that?
Yes.
Okay. Was there anybody else besides your wife that you can recall ever talking about your conversation with Mark Jensen about where you used the words ethylene glycol or antifreeze?
Then the next morning, I talked to Ron Ruck. Ron is a co-manager of mine and would have attended the conference with me. And that morning, on the way to the meeting, I stopped by his room to pick him up to go down to the morning session.
I understand you talked to him, but did you talk to him about ethylene glycol or antifreeze?
Yes, I did. I told him about the Benadryl and ethylene glycol that Mark wanted to kill his wife.
Now, did you only have one conversation with Ron Ruck?
No.
Let me finish, please, sir. Did you only have one conversation with Ron Ruck about this conversation, or had you had more than one conversation with Ron Ruck over the number of days just after this conference?
Yes, I did, because Ron and I would have flown back together on the airport, in the airplane, and we talked on the airplane.
So, now as you're sitting here now today, can you tell us for certain that you mentioned the words ethylene glycol in which one of these conversations, or on all of these conversations?
It was all conversations with him.
So that's your recollection as you're sitting here today?
Yes.
But this was 9 years ago.
That's correct.
Objection. He's answered the question.
Well, okay.
Now, you've been asked a lot of questions about a dinner that you attended.
Yes.
Let me finish, sir. And a conference that you attended that occurred 9 years ago, correct?
That's correct.
And now, if we were to ask you about a conference that you attended 8 years ago, would you have as detailed a recollection of that
No,
convention?
because it would not have been so vivid in my mind. I mean, this was so unusual. I mean,
This is the only convention you ever attended where somebody told you about planning to kill their wife?
that's correct.
And that's why it sticks in your mind.
Yes, I mean, it's very, oops, I'm sorry, very vivid.
Let's go back to the flowers again. What was your purpose in having a flower arrangement delivered to somebody?
It was to thank the members of the transition team for the hard work that they did in making our office a successful start, the ACATS team.
So did you discuss with anybody the appropriateness of sending a bouquet of flowers to this group of people?
Yes, I did.
List all of the people that you spoke with when you were discussing whether or not to send a bouquet of flowers to this transition team.
The only person that I would have talked to was my wife, Joanne.
So you talked to your wife, Joanne, about this?
Yes,
And was this before or after you'd sent the bouquet of flowers?
it was after,
Afterward.
I believe, yes.
And as you're sitting here now today, do you remember which specific member of the team actually was the recipient or the person that these flowers were sent to?
I believe it was Dawn Cooper's name was on the card.
Do you know if anybody else's name was on the
It
card?
would have been her name plus the ACATS team, but I don't remember any other names.
Now, describe, if you will, tell me everything you can remember about what Dawn Cooper looks like. Give me a complete description. First of all, about how old is Dawn Cooper?
I believe she's 40, 45.
Now, is that how old she was then, or that's how old she is now?
How old she'd be now?
Okay, so back then she's about 36?
Correct.
Okay. About how tall is she?
5'7", maybe 5'6".
What color hair did she have, if you remember?
I don't recall.
How much would she weigh?
250, 280.
Now, there was discussion about flirting or not flirting. Were you ever coming on? Do you understand the term? Do you understand the term coming on to somebody?
Yes.
Okay. Were you ever coming on to Dawn Cooper?
No, it's just my personality to be friendly and be happy and find out about people.
Okay. And so you were being friendly with Dawn Cooper,
Correct, friendly.
and she was being friendly with you.
Correct.
Did you ever proposition Dawn Cooper?
No, I did not.
And you know what I mean by
I
proposition.
mean, did I want to have sex with her?
Well, I don't know what you wanted to do, but what did you ask her about?
No, I did not ask her for any sexual favors or proposition.
And these flowers that you sent, were these flowers intended as a means to perhaps get you up to that point, or were these flowers intended to simply express gratitude for the assistance that they provided in your transition team?
There was no sexual intention. They were gratitude and thanking for the fact that they had spent 15 hours a day for probably 4 days. I mean, they worked very hard and were time away from their families.
I have no further questions. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Klug, you indicated that you read the criminal complaint in this case, right?
Yes, I did.
Followed all the news coverage, right?
I watched it from afar, yes.
You read the articles, right?
Which articles?
Newspaper articles about the case.
The only article that I remember was when he was charged and the article about the Supreme Court. Those are the only two articles that I remember reading.
You were following the case throughout, right?
Yes.
And in reading the criminal complaint, you knew that there was some allegation involving crystals, right?
I don't recall.
Would it help you to review the criminal complaint? Would that refresh your recollection as to what you would?
If I read the criminal complaint now, yes, I mean, I can read it, sure.
Counsel, you've got me at a disadvantage. I didn't bring a copy with. You have one that I can read?
This is my last one. Here.
I wrote it, but I don't remember what's in it, so.
Mr. Klug issued, it's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit 27. I just invite your attention, pages aren't numbered, but page 3 around the center of the page. Let's read those couple paragraphs.
Yes, the criminal complaint does have ethylene glycol.
And crystals, right?
Correct.
That's where you probably first heard information about crystals, right?
No.
And now, would it be fair to say that from 1998 until July 30th, 2007, you talked about this case with your wife continually?
Objection, this was already asked on cross-examination. It's outside the scope of redirect examination.
What was
Overall,
continually?
No.
Did you make the following statement when you testified on July 30th, 2007, lines 5 through line 7, page 83? The question was, other than maybe those secretaries, did you talk to anybody else about this in 2003? Answer, I talked to my wife about it continually.
Okay.
And did you talk to your wife about this case continually?
We talked about it a few times.
So how many total did you talk to your wife about it?
I thought I already answered that.
if you did, that's an objection that Mr. Jambois can make, and I'll rule on it, but otherwise you must answer the question.
I've objected in the past, Your Honor, but I'll object again. The question's been asked and answered several times.
Right, and I'll tell you, you have a pretty permissive attitude about that type of thing unless it gets
That's why they've
oppressive,
been
so-
overruled, so I
Okay, so go
stopped making
ahead.
the objection.
Mr. Klug, you can answer.
Can you repeat the question?
How many, give me a number, how many times did you talk to your wife about the conversation you had with Mark Jensen? I think you just said a few. There it said continually. I'm looking for a number.
From what period of time?
From 1998 to 2007.
Six to 10 times.
6 to 10 times over a period of 9 years is continually?
You asked for a number, yes.
Okay. I wanted to understand what you meant by continually, and about once a year is continually.
It's continuing.
Oh, you have the transcript up there, don't you, Mr. Klug? D25?
I have D25, yes.
And my understanding is that you were saying that you testified about ethylene glycol when you testified about the conversation from the airport with your wife, right?
That's correct.
And let me invite your attention to page 95, Mr. Klug. Lines 13 through 21, which I believe is your testimony about that telephone call from the payphone at the airport.
What lines are you talking about?
Lines 13 to 21, Mr. Klug.
Okay, and what's your question?
Could you just read that to yourself for a moment?
Okay.
And you don't say anything about ethylene glycol or antifreeze or anything else that you said in that conversation.
Objection, Your Honor. The question was not posed to him about ethylene glycol, and if you put that in context, you'll see that. And I'd request that the court read the transcript.
I think the proper way to do it is to ask your question, then read from the transcript.
Well, right before we broke and Mr. Jamboy started redirect examination, you indicated that you testified at the last hearing about ethylene glycol. Do you recall that? Do you recall saying that right before Mr. Jamboys began questioning again?
I don't know what point you're talking about.
The last questions that I was asking you before Mr. Jamboys started asking you questions again was about whether you had mentioned anything about ethylene glycol in your testimony of July 30th. Do you recall that?
Are you talking about today?
Yes.
When he brought the transcript up and wanted
Okay.
to- and challenged you to look through it.
Okay.
And you indicated that you had said something about ethylene glycol at that hearing during the portion of your testimony that related to your conversation at the airport with your wife, right?
That's correct.
And that portion of the transcript there relates to the conversation you had with your wife at the airport, right?
No, it relates to a receipt.
Question, line 11, page 163. What was the next? Oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong one. Let's get to the next exhibit. Line 13, question, and that...
Excuse me, counsel, I have no idea what day or...
Mr. Klug's testimony, page 95, line 13, that I just asked him to
Okay.
read.
All right, there's a request for a break here. So we might as well take a full break now, and let me ask that you return at 1 o'clock. Is that convenient for everybody? 1 o'clock, please don't talk about the case during the break.
Please all rise.
Antifreeze or ethylene glycol to these prosecutors at any time until right before this trial or in court here. And do I call them as witnesses? Do they stipulate that in this meeting of July 27th, for example, that he didn't say anything? Do I call them as witnesses? What's the solution? Because he didn't say anything to him, and I'm entitled to have the jury know that.
Well, he says you want to cross-examine. In what way do you want to do it?
Well, I didn't say that. All I did was raise the dilemma, and one among the possibilities, and I don't think it's a full solution by any stretch. And I agree with Mr. Jamboys that it's problematic because it doesn't solve the problem. I have Ms. Gabrielle's notes, and there's nothing here about ethylene glycol or antifreeze, and obviously that would be of significant importance to the DA's office since they'd been floating this theory for at least 5.5 years, and would have said, well, did he say anything about antifreeze? And there's nothing here in these notes. And now, since he just testified for the first time ever about antifreeze, I think it's an important point, but I'm stuck because they didn't have an investigator with them.
Well, let's begin with the first premise, which is there's no question he has a right to cross-examine.
He has no question, he has no right to.
There's no question, he has the right to cross-examine Mr. Klug about the content of this conversation with Ms. Gabrielle.
Correct. I agree with that.
The second premise would be that he could use her notes if he says that his memory is exhausted at a certain point. He could use her notes to attempt to refresh his recollection, even though they are not of his authorship.
Well.
But beyond
I don't see any foundation.
after that, then we get into a really dense thicket.
Your Honor, and I don't mean to be, it's not as though we're trying to withhold these notes. It's not, we just want to make sure they come in the right way. And there'd be no foundation for this witness to look at these and know what they are. There's no way that this
So he
witness.
can use anything that can refresh a witness's recollection can be used to do so, whether it's of his authorship or not.
I suppose that's true, but there's no way to authenticate what these are. Unless we have Ms. Gabrielle testify, or unless there's a stipulation. I would be prepared to stipulate that these are the notes of Ms. Gabrielle. But as she's sitting here, apparently in Ms. Gabrielle's room, she took these notes during a telephone conversation with Mr. Klug, or if she took these notes during the second conversation that occurred between Mr. Klug and Ms. Gabrielle and myself, when she took these notes when she met with him just before he testified. And I'm not sure what her recollection is of that. And my understanding is that there were those 3 conversations. And I don't know which these notes reflect. And I don't know if she does. You'd have to ask her.
I think we get out of the bind if the prosecution stipulates that Mr. Klug did not tell them anything about antifreeze or ethylene glycol on July 27th.
Well, I wouldn't stipulate to that. What I'm going to stipulate is that these notes can come in with the understanding that these notes were made. And I would have Ms. Gabrielle offer to the court what her recollection is about when these notes were made. Because, for example, these notes contain much that are consistent with what his testimony is.
Well, don't put me in a position of my deciding, how good a note taker she is. That's for the jury to decide.
I understand, but it contains, for example, howtokillyourwife.com. There's a reference to that in there. So
They can't rehabilitate with the notes. It's still, all that is hearsay, but I can certainly establish that he's failed to do this on a prior occasion. And right now I'm left without being able to close that gap because I don't have an investigator to call on that, or a report or anything else. But it's abundantly clear that antifreeze is what this case is about, and that Mr. Jamboys and Ms. Gabrielle asked him about that, and he never said anything about it. And it would be the first thing in the notes, and it would have been the first thing that they would have questioned him about on July 30th. They would have said, he said something about antifreeze.
His request, Mr. Jamboys, is that you stipulate that during a conversation with Ms. Gabrielle on the 27th of July,
Mr. Klug did not mention anything about antifreeze.
yes, and I guess we would stipulate to that with the understanding that since we can use any document to refresh a witness's recollection on the redirect or something, at some point we're going to ask him what he recalls telling Ms. Gabrielle. And if he doesn't remember everything that's on here, we'll give this document to him and ask him if that refreshes his recollection.
Well, understand something. Number one, you still first have to plead exhaustion of recollection. And secondly, that doesn't mean that document comes in. That means that he can look at it in an effort to rehabilitate his faulty memory. But so this is not going to be a vehicle for you to introduce his notes into the record.
Yeah, I agree with the court. It's hearsay. And almost everything on here has already been testified to by Mr. Klug, so there's no need to repeat it simply because he said it before. And it's not relevant to the trustworthiness of a person's statements, how many times he says it.
And we don't want to, the state
does not wish to withhold information, Your Honor. It is our recollection that Mr. Klug did not mention the words antifreeze during the course of his conversation, at least any conversation I was in leading up to that hearing. And there's no note to that effect in Ms. Gabrielle's notes, and she takes much better notes than I do. And there's not, and if he had used the words antifreeze, I assure you she would have written it in there. So I guess we could stipulate that Mr. Klug did not mention the word antifreeze in his conversations with Ms. Gabrielle or myself prior to the commencement of the forfeiture hearing. Would you agree with that? Yeah, and so I
30th of July.
I would say when Mr. Klug was interviewed on 2 occasions by the prosecutors in this case on July 27th, 2007, he said nothing about antifreeze or ethylene glycol.
Well, I wouldn't say he said nothing, but he used the words antifreeze, but he may have used the words crystallized from the inside out. I'm not sure about that. And that's what antifreeze does to you.
Well,
But he didn't say antifreeze or ethylene glycol. That
well, I
is
don't
the
know what he
point.
said. Ms. Gabrielle would be in the best position.
Well, I was there too, and I don't...
All right. Look,
I'm sorry, and if they'd said crystallized on the inside out, that would be on. That would be
well,
on.
let's do this. And I can't tell you what to stipulate to. All I can do is try to facilitate a stipulation and to avoid what seemed to me is less desirable, very undesirable alternative. Which is that it sounds like your basic agreement that at no time prior to his giving testimony on the 30th of July of last year, did Mr. Klug state to the mention the district attorney either ethylene glycol or
Antifreeze.
antifreeze?
That is, I would stipulate that.
Is that an acceptable stipulation, Mr. Muller?
At no time prior to July 30th. My only concern is it sounds like he said it afterwards.
Okay, at no time prior to the hearing in open court on, at no time prior to the, put the system on with you. At no time prior to the, hearing in open court on the 30th of July of 2007, did Mr. Klug mention to the district attorney ethylene glycol or antifreeze?
My preference would be if it said specifically in the interviews on July 27th, which
I think that's, I'm going to stipulate to that then.
That'd be fine.
During the interviews of the 27th of July, with Ms. Gabrielle and Mr. Jambois, Mr. Klug did not mention ethylene glycol or antifreeze.
Correct. I would
Okay.
stipulate to that.
And that's an acceptable stipulation?
yes.
And so is the court going to read that stipulation to the jury then, Your Honor, before we recommence Mr.
Well, I
Klug's
was hoping that one of you would volunteer to do it, but if not,
I'll gladly read it, but I should, I'm sorry, I should.
at no time during the interviews of Mr. Klug by Mr. Jambois or Ms. Gabrielle. This is not a good start, but since you've got a part written down, we're going to continue. On July 27th, 2007, did Mr. Klug mention ethylene glycol or antifreeze?
And especially since I was the one who suggested July 27th, I'm loath to bring this up, but Ms. Kavidra pointed out that there was one interview on July 30th as well, prior to court. So I'd say on July 27th and July 30th.
Agreeable?
No problem with that, Your Honor.
Okay. All right, then, anything else before we start?
And when would the court anticipate that I read that
When do you want to?
stipulation? I think immediately after Mr. Klug's testimony.
Is that agreeable?
Immediately after his testimony or before his testimony?
I was going to say immediately after.
No, I would say immediately before the testimony, so the witness is made aware of it.
Well, it's a stipulation. I mean, it must be accepted as conclusively proved.
Yes, and so I say it should be
Witness
read
doesn't
right
need to be
away.
aware of it. A witness's awareness is irrelevant.
Mr. Klug is clearly operating under the mistaken impression that he talked to us about this at some
Well,
point.
you know, I'm just telling you that basically what we're telling the jury is what your response to that is, if you were called as witnesses without having to go through that.
Okay.
So let's do it, I think, the way Mr. Albee wants, and he's still under examination, so if you think there's something that needs to be clarified, you may do so. Anything else?
No, Judge.
All right, would you ask the jury to come in, please? Go ahead, Mr. Albee.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Klug, during the break, you had an opportunity to review Defendant's Exhibit 25, which is the transcript of your prior testimony, correct?
Yes.
And is it accurate to say that at no time during your testimony did you mention the words antifreeze or ethylene glycol? True?
That's correct.
And in terms of who you contacted, are you certain that you did not also contact the Pleasant Prairie Police Department?
That's correct.
And how is it that you're certain now, when at the last hearing you indicated that you had contacted the Pleasant Prairie Police Department?
Because I found my notes from 2002.
And earlier today, when I was questioning you, you recalled specifically talking with someone in the DA's office, true?
That's correct.
And is that your best recollection?
No, it isn't, after looking at my notes that I had left a voice message.
Well, there seems to be an indication on those notes that you actually called twice, is that right? You have those in front of you? Aren't there two dates there?
No, that the date is March 21st, 02, then the notation under it is the time, 4/10/02.
Or that could be a second date, April
That's-
10th, 2002.
No, that's not, because there's a colon between the 4 and the 10, that's a time.
And so you wanted to be that precise that you wanted to say you left this message at 4 o'clock, 10 after 4 in 2 seconds?
Yes, sir.
And you testified at the last hearing that you specifically remembered talking to a detective from the Pleasant Prairie Police Department, true?
That's correct.
And it may be that you did talk to somebody and didn't keep a note, true?
I don't recall.
Now, those notes in front of you, those also say nothing about antifreeze, right?
That's correct.
They say nothing about ethylene glycol, right?
They talk about Benadryl.
That's right. They say, is the word ethylene glycol in there?
No, there isn't.
And you never told any law enforcement officer this story about Mark Jensen killing his wife until they confronted you, right?
That's correct.
And when confronted, it would have been very embarrassing to say you had been lying to your colleagues, right?
No, because I wasn't lying.
Would have been embarrassing to admit you were lying, right?
No,
Objections, irrelevant hypothetical.
The objection's overruled.
And it would have been very embarrassing to you.
No.
Objection asked and answered. The witnesses.
Well, I don't know, I haven't heard it yet.
no, it would not be
It
embarrassing.
would have been embarrassing.
No.
Just wait till the question, okay?
Sorry.
To you to tell them that you enjoyed the attention you were receiving from telling your stories about Mark Jensen after the time his wife passed away.
Repeat the question.
Sure. It would have been very embarrassing to you to tell the prosecutors when they confronted you that you enjoyed the attention you received from telling these exaggerated, made-up stories about Mark Jensen.
They're not exaggerated, made-up stories.
That's all I have, Mr. Klug.
Mr. Jowett?
Well, Your Honor, at what point were we going to advise the jury of the stipulation between the parties? Could we advise them of that stipulation now?
I suppose,
I'd request, Your Honor, then that the jury be advised of the stipulation. I didn't write it down.
I will be happy to provide the stipulation. The parties here, the prosecution and Mr. Jensen, have stipulated to the following. At no time during the interviews of Mr. Klug by Mr. Jamboys or Ms. Gabrielle on July 27th and July 30th, 2007, did Mr. Klug mention ethylene glycol or antifreeze? That's the stipulation of the parties.
Is that a correct statement of stipulation, Mr. Jewett?
I believe it is, Your Honor.
All right. Stipulation is an agreement between the lawyers as to what certain facts are, and there is no dispute about it. There'll be no further evidence permitted on the subject since it is established, and you're to accept that as conclusively proved in the case. Any question about that at all? Okay, thanks.
Mr. Klug, you have a recollection, do you have a recollection of, say, significant historical events that have occurred in this country during the course of your lifetime? Say, for example, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King?
Yes, there are significant events.
So you remember seeing or hearing of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King at or about the time it occurred?
Yes.
Do you remember every single person you spoke to about the assassination and the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King?
No.
But yet he is nonetheless assassinated, correct?
That's correct.
So there's no question in your mind that you heard of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King?
Yes.
And you remember certain things about it?
Yes.
And there are things you don't remember about it?
This is leading.
That's correct.
Well, it is, but it's something,
I think it's also argument, but
it is argumentative, but go ahead. We'll bear with it.
I wasn't going to be much longer on that line. Your Honor.
That would be wonderful.
So as you're sitting here today, do you or do you not remember Mark Jensen speaking of antifreeze and murdering his wife in the early morning hours of November 7th, 1998?
What I do remember was Mark talking about killing his wife. And after reading my testimony, there was nothing in there about the antifreeze.
But I'm not asking you about your testimony now.
Okay.
I'm asking you to think back to the conversation that occurred in November of 1997, I'm sorry, November of 1998, between you and Mark Jensen in the hotel lobby. Now, without regard to your testimony,
Yes.
today, yesterday, in July, without regard to any previous conversations you've had with anybody else except for Mark Jensen, as you're sitting here now today, do you actually remember whether or not Mark Jensen used the words antifreeze or ethylene glycol in the course of that conversation?
I do not remember him talking about those terms.
Now, after that conversation that you had with Mark Jensen, did you talk to other persons while that conversation was fresher in your mind?
I would have talked to my wife, Joanne Klug, and also Ron Ruck.
And when you spoke with your wife, Joanne Klug, that was contemporaneous to or in within the 24 hours of that conversation?
That's correct.
And so at that time, were matters still fresh in your mind?
As of what I can remember, I talked about the Benadryl and the polyethylene glycol that is in Benadryl. It's that I
believe
was in Benadryl.
Okay. So let's go back again now. You recall Mark Jensen talking about Benadryl?
Correct.
What did he say about Benadryl?
He told me that Benadryl,
this has been gone through the exact same question several times.
I'm going to be briefly permissive about this, Mr. Jensen. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. That means you can continue to answer the question, sir.
yes, sir, that the chemical properties or the makeup of Benadryl would not be able to be traced, that it was like an undetectable poison that would be in your body.
And then, at some point that evening, you talked to your wife.
That's correct.
And the next day, you talked to your wife.
Yes.
And at the time that you spoke to your wife, these matters are still fresh in your mind.
Yes, they were.
No further questions.
Raleigh?
Mr. Klug, you did in fact read your wife's transcript, right?
No, I did not.
That's where you got the information about ethylene glycol at the airport, right?
No.
Okay, that's all I have.
Any questions? Mr. Chairman?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Right, you may step down, sir. I think that's actually Mr. Alby's copy.
Is that Mark?
No, that's actually the exhibit, you're right, that is the court's.